welcome to everyone to the 8th summer sessions arranged by Finnish Institute of International Affairs and Center on U.S. Power and Politics. The original idea for the summer sessions was to gather people from different worlds, as it were, academic, policy, politicians, businesses, and be able to exchange ideas on a range of issues related to the U.S. Today's session, of course, will touch on one critical part where the U.S. has a great role, global trade economics. And the whole summer sessions this year, there are 5 separate panels. Try to look at what is the emerging U.S. role in this, if you want to call it great power competition global system or something, but what is the emerging U.S. role in this? I'd like to thank, before you get started, my fellow Institute staff, everyone who's a member at KUSP, but especially Maiju Hinsberg, without whom none of the practical arrangements would be possible. So thank you. I hope you have a great session, and over to you, Michael.
Thanks a lot, Charlie, and well, good afternoon on my part as well. Good morning to those on the other side of or in the Western Hemisphere. My name is Mikael Wigell, and I work as FIA's director of the Global Security Research Program, of which the Center on U.S. Power and Politics forms part. And I have the great pleasure to host this or chair this webinar, in which we will discuss the EU-US trade relationship and a sort of current agenda for the EU-US trade cooperation, and we especially ask our panelists to ponder a bit on the prospects for the EU and the US to perhaps resolve some of their current trade disputes. We all know that it's been a difficult few past years, especially under the Trump presidency, and perhaps also to ponder a bit on whether a freer trade agenda can be revived, and perhaps also how the EU and the US could develop perhaps a bit more strategic partnership or strategic trade approach together, and also in terms of perhaps addressing some of the related broader issues, such as climate change, the WTO reform, and what we could perhaps call the China challenge, and also perhaps some practical issues around supply chains, the COVID-19 problematic when it comes to trade and so on and forth. And before presenting our speakers, panelists, I'd like to take the opportunity to flag for our new FIA Geoeconomics publication series. At FIA, we've been focusing on geoeconomics for many years already. It's very much a priority focus for us. And now we've also have a dedicated publication series within this research field. So go and check it out if interested in these sorts of issues. We also currently have several externally funded research projects, either which have already started or are about to start now in September and October, if I remember correctly, with some EU Commission funding, with funding from the Nordic Council of Ministers, with funding from the Finnish government, and they are relating to this broader theme of geoeconomics and security of supply, economic security, and issues like this, some of which can be found at our web page already. But now let me introduce today's speakers in this webinar. So Peter Chase will provide some opening remarks. Peter is currently Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund in Brussels. Previously, he has served as the Vice President for Europe at the US Chamber of Commerce, and as a US diplomat with postings as Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs in the US Mission to the European Union, Director of the State Department's Office of EU Affairs, Chief of Staff to the Undersecretary of Economic Affairs, and Counselor and Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs in the US Embassy in London. Great to have you here, Peter. Then we'll have Penelope Naas, who is President for International Public Affairs and Sustainability at United Parcel Services, now based in Washington, D.C., having previously been based in Brussels. She has also worked for Citigroup, and before that for the US Department of Commerce in various roles, including leading the Office of Europe and working both in the Clinton and Bush administrations on trade issues. And lastly, we'll have Yana Titievskaya, who's a policy analyst for international trade at the European Parliamentary Research Service, the sort of in-house think tank of the European Parliament, if that's how you can, I guess that's a bit how you can frame it. And previously, Yana has worked at the European Commission in various roles, including at DG Trade and the European Economic and Social Committee. And Yana is also a fresh, non-resident fellow at FIA, and we're very pleased to have you in that role here with us as well. Before handing over to Peter, I'd like to remind everybody that any questions and comments can be posted in the chat function, which I'll be monitoring. And indeed, we'll only deal with those to make it a bit more manageable. But we'll make sure that there are time left for debate and as well towards the end of this webinar. And with that, I'll hand over to Peter for his initial remarks. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikael, and thank you very much for inviting me to join you this morning, or this morning for me anyway, in any event. I'm sitting, while I'm based in Brussels, I'm actually sitting here in the United States, visiting my grandson who had his 5th birthday. So now I just want to make sure everything and the importance of everything is in perspective. You know, I was really delighted to come and join you on this, and I noticed the evolution of the title was kind of originally more about the future of multilateral institutions, and now it's become about the United States and the international order. And I think part of the reason for that evolution, I think, is probably because of Afghanistan. But the way it was framed in the description is the US, until recently, the order's putative leader, continues to grapple with the aftershocks of the Trump presidency. I think that's an important framing, but the use of the word putative leader struck me, because in the Trump administration's very first trade agenda of March 2017, they talked about US trade policy for the past 70 years having been based on the notion that there were putative geopolitical advantages to giving up our protections and opening the US market. And I just felt the resonance between these two words. I think the United States is a leader. It's not the leader, it doesn't need to be the leader, it needs to be a leader, and that's part of what we're finding. In my remarks today, and I'll try to keep them within that 15 minutes that you gave me, Mikael, I'd like to put US trade policy in a geopolitical context, to talk about it in a way of geoeconomics, and not just US trade policy, but specifically the US-EU economic relationship. You know, I'm one of those people who pushed very, very hard for something called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. TTIP has become a bad word in Europe, and we need to think seriously about why. We need to learn the lessons from that, and we need to see the US-EU economic cooperation in this broader geopolitical context so that we can do the right things that TTIP was intending to do without creating the problems that TTIP created. And for me, the creation of this new US Trade and Technology Council, which will be meeting for the first time at the end of this year, the purpose of that should be precisely how do we do this? How do we have the US-EU relationship? How do we see it in this broader geopolitical context? How do we see it as part of our strengths and our assets? How do we make it better without creating the anxiety that TTIP did do? The reason I think that we need to put it in a broader geopolitical context is China. I mentioned Afghanistan. Everyone's talking about Afghanistan and what Afghanistan means to the end of the world. It's horrible what's happened there. It did not happen the way it should have done, but it is not that important in the end. It was poorly done by the United States. You can't spend so much money doing what you're doing and not get a good result. I think we were asking of the Afghans and of ourselves some of the impossible things. It's an issue that needs to be managed, but it is not a geopolitical problem unless we make it one. And that means that the United States, very much as it did after the issue of the 70s, the fall of Vietnam, the Watergate trials, the problems that we had with Iran, all of those things, the United States went through them and came back. It can still go through this and come back. And the issue then, to me, the bigger strategic issue is how you said manage the China challenge. I think it is adjusting to China and China's role in the world and trying to make sure that we avoid a situation where China becomes an enemy and instead where we are all working together for humanity's betterment. And we need to think through how we're going to do that. And US-EU economic cooperation is a strong part of the managing the China challenge, if you want to put it that way. I think that it's interesting to know that the predecessor of the Trade and Technology Council was the Transatlantic Economic Council, which met for the first time in November of 2007. Penny and I were both there, very much involved in the creation of this before we both came to Brussels in the summer of 2007, and because it was created during the German presidency of that year. The very first strategic talk they had was how the United States and Europe were going to collaborate about China. And I think that this was something that they could have and should have, and it led to a lot of very important cooperation between us. I think that when we're doing this, we need to do a couple of things. We need to understand where China comes from. And the Chinese have every right to be a little bit sensitive about how others address them after their century of humiliation following the Opium Wars. They have every right to be very proud of what they've done now. And I think that the important thing is managing their, we have to recognize their aspirations to be a global leader. We have to work with that in mind. But we have to nudge them into being a, quote, responsible global citizen. They will find out a little bit about what that means as they deal with the debt issues coming from the Belt and Road Initiative, because we all went through the debt crises of the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s. China is about to have its own debt crisis, and how responsible they are will depend on how they respond to that. We need China's problems. The problem China creates economically is largely due to its history of current account surpluses, the money that's pumped into their system. They're trying to manage it. It's been the basis of a lot of the overcapacity and what we call subsidization. It's easy money. Easy money policy has done a lot of this stuff. And I think we need to help China realize that it needs to address those problems, just as we did, without exporting them to the rest of the world, which is what they have been doing. And I think to do this, we're going to have to do a couple of things. First, Europe in particular needs to indicate to China very quietly that military aggressive activity towards Taiwan is not acceptable and would have serious consequences. And Europeans need to think through what those consequences are and be willing to undertake them, not necessarily military. That's number one. Number two, the Europeans have to push on the United States to calm its own rhetoric. And I think the people in the Biden administration, Kurt Campbell, Jake Sullivan, and others, know how to deal with China and know there's a way to manage this as a cooperative and competitive relationship rather than necessarily a confrontational one. But if we can keep China back on Taiwan and do these other things, then we have to help China manage the transition from overcapacity, which we all went through, to undercapacity without going through a lot of what's the word? Redundancies and the political things that come from that, because Xi Jinping and others who grew up through the Cultural Revolution are deeply afraid of internal strife. But to do any of this stuff, right? To do any of this stuff, we, the United States and Europe, need to improve our economic relationship. We need to start by understanding it's investment-based. It is not a trade-based relationship. And that is so important, because what we do is economic policy in our own territories deeply affects our own companies, because they're actively operating in both territories. 65-70% of all major US European companies are kind of based on both sides of the Atlantic. With that, the idea of TTIP was to bring us closer together. It would have been the first US-EU treaty, if you want to put it that way, that was ratified by the US Congress. It would have had a geopolitical context as well as an economic one. But what is the lesson that we learned in TTIP? The lesson we learned in TTIP is that you cannot bring regulatory issues into a trade negotiation. There is a way. We have two large economies, they're democracies. Our people, through our politicians, set our regulatory standards. You can't bring in questions that are democratically decided, politically decided, as trade negotiating items. You have to keep those separate and then bring it together, understanding that because we have a investment-based relationship, because all of our trade, our $1 trillion of trade between us is intra-company, that our regulators, for their own purposes, need to cooperate. If they cooperate in keeping our people, our environment, our workers, our investors safe, that's their job. If they're cooperating, they'll be able to do their own job better. But people in Europe should not fear that there is anything dealing with regulatory safeties is being put in the hands of trade negotiators. I can get into this into great depth, way too much, so I won't do it. But I would argue that even the most sensitive agricultural safety, food safety issues can be handled well by regulatory cooperation. It will take time. And I know Senator Grassley from Iowa will never get his biotech corn into Europe, and we've got to figure out how that's going to work. But there are ways to get around all of this, and there are some things that I've written about, and I'd be happy to talk more about. But again, I think that the purpose of bringing us together, when we started TTIP in 2013, it was launched primarily as it was talked about as an economic issue. It was, in my view, even though I was interested in the economics, it was much more a political issue. It was a part of a system of events, including the Transatlantic Partnership, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was oriented towards nudging China. And we need to go back and think about these economic policy questions in that broader political context again. I'll stop there. I really do look forward to the comments by Penny and Jana, and to the discussion that we can have with those of us in the waiting room. So I really do hope that we can have a lot of back and forth afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Peter, and thanks for those insights, which I think gave us a lot of food for thought. Now, let's have a discussion towards the end. So let's go forward. If Penny would like to give her remarks at this point. Your microphone is still unmuted.
There we go. Sorry, I muted. Thanks for that overview, Peter, and for giving us all that context with regards to the relationship. If I could, I'd like to focus a little bit more on the practicalities at the moment of what's really going on with regards to international trade. So I'm with UPS, United Parcel Service. We have currently 540,000 employees around the world. We have another 100,000 employees who work for us directly in countries around the world as our representatives. We are in the United States the largest union, one of the largest unionized employers in the United States. We have about 350,000 Teamster employees inside UPS. And so with the Biden administration talking about a worker-centered trade policy, my company really lives that mantra. Excuse me. So UPS, we serve 220 countries and territories around the world. We're in everywhere, and we deliver things from essential services to, we've delivered over 600,000 vaccines at this, 600 million vaccines globally around the world at this time, including to some really far-flung parts of the world. And the vaccines we're delivering are the ultra cold chain vaccines, the really complicated ones that have been, I think, critical to some of the recoveries we've seen. So I want to take a step back with regards to what's really going on in trade at the moment before I talk about the US-EU context. So on a very practical level, we are seeing massive disruptions in supply chains globally at the moment. And the cause for this are manifold. One cause of some of the disruptions is differing COVID pandemic measures that countries are taking with regards to how they treat the people that actually make trade move. So you may have seen the third largest port in China shut down recently. We've had some disruptions in some of our airports in China and in Vietnam, in India. We can't fly somebody who's been in India to several countries around the world. We have people who've been in the UK, they can't go to certain places, and it changes by the week. It's an enormously complicated time to try to schedule an air network that is full of 3,000 pilots flying around the world on a weekly basis, moving goods, and yet it's a lot of this person can't go there, this person can go there, but not there next week type thing. And it's really, really challenging. And that's something that I think is underappreciated by people when it comes to how supply chains move around the world. The second thing that's happening is the demand and supply shocks that have taken place during COVID, where certain products have become very popular and certain other products have not. But then there's been a huge shift back. And supply chains have had difficulties in grappling with some of these extreme changes that have been going on in global supply chains. The third has been, and I think you've all seen it in the semiconductor space, there have been underinvestment in certain industries for a wide variety of reasons that have now surged in the things that are needed. We saw it with PPE during the crisis. We're seeing it with semiconductors today. And all of that, I think, is leading to a lot of these massive disruptions that are going on. Last I checked, there were 40 boats sitting off Long Beach, California, waiting to be unloaded. In the United States, we don't unload boats 24/7. We unload boats only during certain hours and not 7 days a week. So when ports around the world are operating at 24/7, but in the US they're not, that's also creating some disruptions and dislocations. The last thing I would say that we're seeing is in terms of disruptions is containers. It's hard to get containers and pallets at the moment. Very practical things. But I was working with one of our folks here at UPS the other day because pallet prices have gone up 2 to 3 times. So a pallet that's normally $5 is now selling for 10 to 15. And so it's hard to get your hands on some of the practicalities. Containers are also being, I would say, hoarded to a certain extent because we're short warehouse space around the world. And so as people have moved to e-commerce, companies have started taking containers and using them as mobile warehouses and using them as stocking and distribution centers for their e-commerce. And so you take a look at all of these different elements that are coming together, and it's creating the conditions that are making it very challenging in international trade at the moment to make sure that supply and demand are matching up. So, and then you throw on top of that for companies kind of the shifting geopolitics and what's going on there. And you have a very complicated rest of 2021 going into 2022. Investment decisions, we're all trying to make and look at investment decisions. That is becoming more challenging in some cases, how and where to make your investment decisions. And I think I'm at least seeing some shifts between brown, what I call UPS brown dollars going into countries versus setting up more strategic commercial relationships, provide a little bit more flexibility for investments moving forward, but also tap into local entrepreneurs and businesses that have been developing in countries around the world. So sorry, maybe a very long practical explanation of what's going on in global trade at the moment, but something to keep in mind. And in Europe in particular, Brexit has really caused some massive shifts in terms of supply chains. We have seen a lot of dislocations as a result of Brexit. And while everybody likes to tout that there's no tariffs, there is tax that takes place on things that move between the UK and the continent. And that adds a huge disincentive to locating your supply chains in the UK if your goods are going back and forth a couple of times and each time you're having to pay tax on it. And that is in turn impacting supply chains in the European context and in intra-Europe supply chains. So when I put the US-EU relationship in this context, I'd just like to say that for UPS, I don't like to talk down about the US-EU relationship. For us, it's the most profitable relationship and most profitable trade lane we have as a company. And for us, looking at the past 18 months, our work in Europe has actually gone relatively well. We have not seen the same troubles, challenges with moving our people in and out of Europe that we've seen in other places. Our aircraft have not had some of the challenges that we've had in other parts of the world. And I think that there's a lot of conversations about how all the problems that exist between the United States and Europe. And I don't think we talk enough about all the good things that are going on between the United States and Europe. We have a ton that's fantastic, and I would say it's 99% fantastic between the US and Europe. And we should be doing more on what's good and how to make it better. And I feel that sometimes we spend time talking about the 1% as opposed to the 99%. And that gives people the impression that things are bad between the US and Europe, when for many companies, it's the absolute reverse. So when I think too about the US and the EU, I mean, Peter talks about the bilateral things that they're doing. There's the tech and there's the TTIP and some of the other things we've talked about. But I think what's really, really important is the WTO. And the reason why is because the US-EU relationship is the basis of the WTO. We are governed by the rules of the WTO. We don't have our own trade agreements. We have some MRAs and some other little things. But in general, the rules by which we trade between the US and the EU has been the WTO. And I think that if we need to really think about how do we invest more in making sure the WTO and the upcoming ministerial in December is a success, and that we think about some of the elements there that we need to focus on as being areas of priority. Because I think there's a real opportunity for the US and Europe to continue to shape this post-COVID economy. There's a lot going on and a lot that's changing in the world today. And I'm sitting and watching it. I've talked about the supply chains. But if you look at labor markets, if you look at the investment trends, if you look at a lot of other things that are going on in the world today, there's a lot of change that's taking place. And you can kind of start to see the elements of what may be a new economic order that may arise coming out of this if people come together and work together. And so for me, what I would really like to encourage the US and the EU to think about is, how do we make the WTO a success? How do we ensure that it focuses on the issues around inclusive trade, not just for goods, but also for services? Because we've seen service employees really impacted during the COVID crisis. How do we ensure that that trade is perceived as being fair? Because right now, there are those that think that trade is not something that's always fair, not only within societies, but between societies. And then how do we make sure that the benefits of trade are felt as broadly as possible? That's both an international thing that can be negotiated, but it's really more about the domestic consensus and working together to improve people's thinking around where trade is beneficial. And again, I want to go back to supply chains, because I think the US and the EU share a lot of values. And when you think about the future of supply chains and trusted partners in supply chains, that should be an area of opportunity for the US and the EU to work together. And when we go into the new, I forget even how, the TTEC or the TEC or the TTEC or however we want to call it, I think one of the things to think about is a lot of the issues that are going to be talked about there have kind of big weighty titles, but are going to be these really specific issues that aren't going to grab headlines. And so there's a little bit of salesmanship that I think Peter and I have always grappled with in the US-EU context of how do you sell these really important but really specific issues in a way that hits the headlines. So let me stop. Let me just kind of, again, talk about, I think supply chains and the issues around supply chains are incredibly complex. They are being impacted by government, unrelated normally, government policies, as well as shifting demand and supply trends that are going on in the world today. Again, I think we need to focus on the WTO, super important for the US-EU relationship. And last, I just think the US and the EU relationship is a whole lot of good, and we need to focus on that good. Yes, we can resolve some of the disputes that are ongoing, but we really need to think about the broader benefits we will achieve if we work together moving forward for our societies. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Penny. Thanks for pointing out and reminding us of the overall positive picture that we do have in the US-EU trade relationship. I think that's really important reminder. Jana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mikael, for the invitation. It's really great to be here. I'm also excited to be joining the Cutting Edge Geoeconomics Research Program as a non-resident fellow. I've been for 12 years abroad, and it's great to be back in the Finnish context, even if as a visiting fellow. So I work for the Parliament, and I want to make clear that I represent very much my personal views today, and in no way this is the views of the Parliament or the EU. And I will proceed in 3 parts. More giving the European perspective after Peter and Penny's more practical and more macro level introductions. And first, I want to give a snapshot summary of what's at stake in the transatlantic relationship, just in terms of the economics of it. And then moving on to the selection of the remaining tensions and the frictions that still kind of plague the trade relationship, and the prospects for the resolution in the next term. So essentially, I completely agree with Penny, or I also wanted to highlight that in spite of the trade tensions that keep coming up and grabbing headlines, the EU and US do have a highly lucrative trade and investment relationship. And the Commission has estimated that only 2% of the trade tensions are resulting or impacting transatlantic trade. And on the graph on the left, you can see that actually COVID-19 has had, in a sense, a larger negative impact on goods trade with the drop, or quite significant drop, in 2020. But nevertheless, the two remain each other's key export partners. They do make up almost half of global trade and GDP, over 40% at least. And to put it into perspective, it's over 3.5 times the 2020 annual budget of the EU that is at stake. And then to go into what the trade consists of, it is indeed largely the same goods that are being traded back and forth. There's pharmaceuticals, chemicals, machinery, optical, medical, surgical equipment. For the EU, motor vehicles make it to the top 5, so cars. For the US, it's also mineral fuels. And then for the services, the EU, in goods, the EU has quite a significant surplus. But in services, it's actually the other way around, or the US has a more narrow surplus there. And the EU has really kind of underlined the importance of services in recent years. So I also want to do the same here. And business services, telecoms, computer services, transport, intellectual property charges like royalties and licenses, and financial services are making up really the bulk of the value of the trade. And at this stage, you might ask, why are they trading the similar goods? And it's exactly how Peter mentioned. They are specializing. It's not exactly that it's comparative advantage setting in. Instead, it's intra-company trade. There's a high degree of product differentiation. And also, it's simply that they can afford to. So in spite of not having TTIP in place, of not having a trade agreement in place, the average applied tariff does remain quite low. And this kind of facilitates trade in the long run. So in spite of the generally lucrative trade relationship, there's these ongoing tensions that I wanted to select this 4 examples that I think are interesting because they are very heterodox in their nature, in terms of what kind of measure they are, and in terms of what areas of economy they concern. But there is a common narrative throughout the 4 of them. And starting with this case of the large civil aircraft dispute. This has been a 17-year dispute in the WTO between the EU and US on the claim that the other side has been unfairly subsidizing or supporting domestic large aircraft manufacturers. And on the 15th of June, there has been a truce on this. So EU and US have agreed to create a cooperative framework, suspend the tariffs, and to essentially start moving forward on this. And what's particularly notable about the truce is this rhetoric change. The 2 sides are now mentioning that they wish to collaborate to address the challenges posed by non-market practices of third countries. And here, of course, the reference is to China. And the same pattern can be found in the steel and aluminum tariff issue. This dispute dates also back to the Trump administration. Just to recall, it's 25% tariffs on steel, 10% tariffs on aluminum that were imposed by President Trump 3 years ago on the basis of national security concerns. And here too, since May 2021, the 2 sides are now negotiating. So EU and US have launched talks following a meeting between USTR Tsai and Vice President Dombrovskis. And in the joint statement, they are acknowledging a shared interest in addressing the global steel and aluminum overcapacities. So again, here, this is referring indirectly to the China subsidization or the unfair trading practices that the 2 sides consider China does. And it's not only a change of tone of being more allied, but it's also, in a sense, underlining that there is a common unfair trade practice issue to be tackled. And now turning to the digital tax, completely separate initiative that took place more at the member state level. Several EU governments, you will probably remember, decided to put in place or plan a digital services tax. France, Spain, the EU itself has announced plans for it. The US threatened it with tariffs and then suspended them once both sides agreed to take the negotiations to G20 OECD context. And now in July, this summer again, there's been an agreement for an inclusive framework on base erosion and profit shifting. And what's interesting here is that there is 135 jurisdictions signing up to the inclusive framework, including China. However, it does not necessarily mean that the EU's or US's hands are tied when it comes to the agreement that has been made. It's more a lowest common denominator agreement that will be the guiding principle for the years to come, but certainly the concrete policies can go to a different direction. And finally, carbon border adjustment, which in Finland is commonly referred to as the carbon tax. This is a mechanism that the EU has proposed in July 21. So the proposal is now out. And US is naturally holding some reservations in the initiative. But my sense is that in principle, under President Biden, the US is aligned or could be potentially aligned with such a measure to the extent that it could even be a potential area for collaboration. Biden has announced his plans to achieve climate neutrality by 2050, and border adjustment measures are explicitly mentioned also. So there's a way forward of collaboration on this, but on the other hand, it will depend very much on the design of the measure and which trade-intensive or carbon-intensive sectors would be eventually selected, not only on EU side, but also on the US side if this took place. Just as an example, if it was, for example, paper, this would concern directly Finnish and German importers, which each represent 5% of US paper imports. So to sum up, I would say that in each of these examples of trade irritants, you can decipher a change in tone, a change in rhetoric. And in a few of these, there's also the mood that is not just about collaboration, but it's uniting against something else, unite against the other. And in many cases, the reference is quite clearly to China. And finally, on the major areas for cooperation, Peter mentioned the former and Penny mentioned the latter, and I'm very much on the same wavelengths on this one. The US Trade and Tech Council has been set up, and it has these ambitious objectives like standard setting and regulatory cooperation, growing the bilateral trade and investment relationship, avoiding technical barriers to trade. And these issues are big, but on a sense, what's I think more interesting is whether they will represent a chance for the EU and US to first align and then kind of spread these principles, spread these ideas to the rest of the world, to other partners. Another thing I find interesting about the TC is the reference to rebalancing of global supply chains in semiconductors, where US is competing for strategic dominance. And of course, here the background context is Biden's supply chain review, where the US has announced a concrete intention to support the domestic production of essential medicines, of advanced batteries, lithium, critical minerals, and of course, semiconductors. So the question I have here is, to what extent will the EU manage to keep collaborating with the US on these reshoring initiatives when, in a sense, there's a domestic imperative to bolster the EU strategic autonomy going on in parallel? And how much can EU companies kind of adapt to initiatives like this in the long run? And there's again a desire to kind of strengthen together, but again, a common adversary to be faced. And again, on the WTO reform, on the other hand, it does appear that the EU, to me, sometimes is more in the driving seat. The WTO is so much in the EU's DNA, and continuously throughout this WTO crisis of the past years, EU rhetoric has kept proclaiming the commitment to the multilateral trading system. And on this issue, the tone has improved as well a lot. So there's on one hand the EU admitting more readily how much it shares US grievances, for example, on this issue of the dispute settlement system, on the need to reform the appellate body, which is still blocked. And the two are also quite clearly stating the need to collaborate on longstanding issues like industrial subsidies, developing country status, again, which concern China since it's joined the WTO. And there's also the common goal of reviving the negotiating function. And my sense here is that there's perhaps going to be more plurilaterals of the willing going forward. I think the great example is the e-commerce negotiations. That's a very prominent plurilateral. And what this might mean is that there could be more regional cooperation, very much like Penny said, EU-US led, but it could also risk leading to a more fragmentation of separate spheres in the international system. So this is another kind of two major areas to watch. And if I would summarize the whole trend, how I see it, and I think it's quite clear, there is a change of rhetoric, there's a change of tone. There's, in many cases, a more ready verbalization of the need to tackle unfair trading practices of China, of other countries. And the question I would like to leave you with is, to what extent could this new tone materialize into concrete trade enhancing measures? So will the tariffs on steel and aluminum really disappear? Will the truce really continue? And are both sides going to be able to do this with the more and more imperative to do state intervention in their own economies in the name of strategic autonomy? I'm thinking in particular of EU regulations that are trying to enforce its toolkit on trade, for example, the anti-coercion instrument, foreign subsidies instruments, these kinds of heavy regulations that could kind of position the EU in a stronger way, but for the US might be seen as a risk. And on the other hand, how could these third countries concerned react and position themselves in response to the tightening transatlantic partnership? So thank you very much, and I leave you at that.
Thanks, Jana, and thanks for putting out those sort of questions as well, and towards the end that we can perhaps reflect a bit more on. But I would like to, since we have two US representatives here with us, I'd like to put up a couple of questions for especially for Peter and Penny on, first of all, this is a bit outside the transatlantic relationship, but certainly I would be interested myself in hearing a bit how, you know, TPP fell through, and there is the kind of China-oriented, developed kind of regional comprehensive economic partnership and so on and forth. What's happening there on that front? I mean, what's the US planning to do now when it comes to the Pacific trade issue, and what's kind of the prospects there? That I think would be interesting from our European perspective as well. And then a bit, and especially to Penny, I'd like to, you know, you talked a lot about the supply chains and the shocks to supply chains that we've seen, the disruptions. Now, I guess that calls for going forward for doing, you know, reorganizing supply chains to some extent to make them more resilient. And do you see that happening, and how in particular are kind of companies now making those changes and reorienting perhaps those supply chains to make them more resilient going forward? I'd be interested in those, some of, you know, more kind of your feelings on that. And thirdly, I'd like to, whether you could all three ponder a bit more on WTO reform issue. I mean, what's the game there now? Where do we stand? Do we see it going forward, and in what way? So those kind of three sets of issues I'd like if you could ponder a bit more around. And if Peter, you go first, Penny, and then Jana.
Thanks very much, and I really appreciated both the presentations by Penny and Jana. The practicalities of trade are really important, and I think it really is important, as Penny did, to remind us about things like the access to containers matters. It does a lot. But I'd also like to point out one thing related to Jana's thing. Not in her list of trade irritants, but one that is directly related. It's related to the whole services issue, the importance of the services industry and services trade, and the digital part is the question about data protection and privacy shield. I mean, some people would prefer not to take that into consideration when they're thinking about trade relations between the United States. But I think, number one, it's economic relations, and number two, the digitalization of everything is a large part of the trade that's happening. So I think that that's an issue that also needs to be thought about. That's a very sensitive one. You asked a really good question about TPP and the trade policy of the United States and of Europe in Asia. I'm actually working on doing a rather extensive survey on that now. But in a lot of ways, I'd be more interested in how Penny sees it, because Penny's sitting in Washington, and UPS has a huge trade, does a huge amount of volume of trade out there. So I'd be really interested in it. In terms of how TPP fell through, again, I go back to that word putative. The very first working day Mr. Trump was in the office, he withdrew the US signature on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And he did so because the view of the Trump administration is that all previous presidents had opened the US economy to other people. They had negotiated bad deals. Mr. Trump can negotiate a better deal because he's no longer thinking about putative geopolitical advantage. He's thinking about the real hardcore economic interests of American workers. And that's how he was framing his trade policy. It was a colossal, stupid error. That's a small editorial comment. How the United States is going to put it back together again is a hell of a good question. I think that it's not going to be, it's actually almost easier at this point for the United Kingdom to ask to join the CTTPP or whatever the hell it is now, the Comprehensive Partnership Trade, whatever. I mean, I can't even remember what it stands for. But the thing is, it's actually a very good trade agreement. It does a lot of good things. I spent a lot of time on it, and it was a wasted effort because of Mr. Trump's failures. And that was a strategic as well as an economic policy failure. On the WTO reform, I think it's really one of the things I wanted to say, because Penny is correct that the WTO is the guiding principle for US-EU trade relations, and that the US and Europe have been very much part of creating what that international trade system has been. I think that Jana's point about how the EU has recognized the merits of some of the complaints that the United States has been making about the WTO dispute settlement system, not just the Trump administration, but it certainly predates it by some time. There are some specific issues related to anti-dumping and countervailing duties and trade defense instruments that need to be addressed. But I think the key to WTO reform, improvement in making it real again, is in fact going to be managing the US, EU, China, and in this case, very importantly, India relationship. And there is an aspect of the tensions between China and India as trading partners that comes into this. But this is where I believe that if you are working more with China and taking it as a recognizing its aspirations, talking about its responsibility for a system that it has benefited from and its people have benefited from, you will need to have them on board, because you cannot make changes to WTO rules without, of course, unanimity, consensus. And if we're going to do things like address industrial subsidies in a more robust way to deal with some of the problems that we've seen in industrial overcapacity in China, not just in steel and aluminum, but in literally everything that's built, then there will have to be, you have to bring all these things together. You can't just put WTO reform off in a corner. You have to see it as part of the overall economic system that we have. And China's role in that is going to be important. I'll stop there.
So maybe just to follow up briefly on kind of what Peter said and to answer some of your questions. So when I look at the Pacific at the moment, where I think the focus is moving, and it's been an area that has been discussed for a couple of years now with the countries out there has been to focus on the digital issues. So I think we'll see, there's been a lot of discussion about whether to launch a Pacific digital agreement, building on some of the work that's been going on among Singapore and some of the other parties, and building off what's in the CPTPP. So that's what I would look for as a kind of a stay tuned. And I think that that's an area where it is ripe for opportunity and for where there's some things that can go forward. And I think that looking at some of the moves by China recently with regards to their desire to put in place some parameters around their digital space, whether it be the cybersecurity rules, some of the data protection rules that China's doing, whether it's some other things around that, there's a very strong motivation, I think, for countries in Asia to want to work with the US and others around the digital issues. Europe is complicated because of its own data privacy rules. It's both a model with GDPR, but it also has created some of its own challenges given some of the things going on in that space that I think makes it more complicated for Europe to come in and enter into flexible negotiations with countries around those issues. With regards to reorganizing supply chains, we have seen some changes going on in that space, but I would also speak to the fact that while people want flexibility in their supply chains, there's also some shortages going on where people are going to have to lock themselves into some long-term contracts. So the things that people suddenly think they need or want, stuff that's needed for battery technology. Right now, if you're trying to buy sustainable aviation fuel in the world, it's almost impossible. Peter, the GMO corn and soybean producers may be able to sell their GMO product to Europe just so it can be refined into sustainable aviation fuel and renewable biodiesel. But if you're trying to get semiconductors, metals for batteries, a few other things, you're not going to get it with flexibility. You're going to get locked into long-term contracts because it's the only way to get some of this stuff that's in short supply at the moment. So it's an interesting dynamic that's going on in terms of people wanting that flexibility to be able to shift their supply chains, but at the same time, there's some things out there that are locking people in. The other is forced labor oversight and some of the social issues that are coming in via SEC and European reporting, that you have to certify your supply chain is not using forced labor, that it's not using certain things. That also makes it challenging to shift your supply chain. But we are seeing companies who are trying to build at least multiple sourcing, so there is some resilience that they're building into their supply chains moving forward. And that's not something government needs to encourage. That's something the markets need to encourage, because people were just driving more and more towards efficiency and losing sight of risk. And so it's something that is more a business issue than necessarily a government issue. On the WTO reform, I actually believe that the most important thing is to get negotiations going again. I think the appellate body is broken because decisions were made and there was no way to revisit those decisions, or for the membership to express that they didn't like the way the decision went and they wanted to pivot and do something different. And so we really need to get the negotiations back up and going. And whether that be, I think e-commerce will hit a midpoint by the end of the year with some good progress, but a ways to go. But we will see agreements on domestic regulation, which is kind of TBT for services. We will see an agreement on investment facilitation. I hope we see an agreement on illegal subsidies for fisheries. I don't understand how people can oppose illegal subsidies for fisheries, such a strong and important environmental issue. And then I hope we see some movement on MSMEs and on women and trade, and we'll probably see some future talk about agriculture and maybe services market access. So it's getting that negotiation back up and running that I think is really critical to then also fixing some of the more complicated appellate reform issues that are out there. Thank you.
All right, thanks for those. Jana, do you want to? There are a couple of questions that we have in the chat. First was one on the EU strategy towards cooperating with its neighbors in light of the sort of Russia challenge. This was specifically in Ukraine. I mean, in building sort of industrial alliances and security supply chain, and how that will kind of play out in this kind of tense climate right now. If you could comment on that. There's another question which kind of has to do with decoupling. Very much kind of, are we toward, we haven't touched much on the decoupling issue here in this debate yet, whether we're actually seeing a truly decoupling going on between, and it's in 10 or 15 or 20 years, will we end up with two big separate economic zones, perhaps a US Europe dominated and another China dominated? Is that where we're heading right now? So those two questions. I had a third one, especially to Peter, since you brought up the issue with the Chinese debt crisis, which I guess is slightly provocative view. I mean, could you elaborate on that a bit? Going forward, and how that would play out. I mean, the interesting thing is, of course, that China doesn't enjoy exorbitant privilege, as the French would call it. That is, they don't have the US dollar to finance it. So how would that play out in that sense? You could elaborate a bit on that. But Jana, on the question of EU cooperation with its neighbors in light of this tensions with Russia, do you have any kind of comments on that?
I would encourage to look at the joint communication of June 2021 of EU on Russia-EU relations. It summarizes quite nicely where we stand on the position towards neighbors, the position towards Russia. There's language about rejecting Russia's pursuit of privileged spheres of influence, but there's also a clear indication that the EU will continue to offer Eastern partners some conditions for prosperity and reforms, also through macro financial assistance. Maybe I'll leave it at that, since the focus is US today.
Peter?
Sure, I love your reference to exorbitant privilege. What I'm talking about is that BRI is in part an economic, the Belt and Road Initiative is in part an economic issue for China. It is a way to get rid of some of the internal pressures built up within the economy. There, where you have a large trade surplus, that all of that money needs to go out, and it needs to go out in certain ways. And this is both a way to get capital out through official channels as opposed to private investment, as well as a way to create markets for some of the surplus capacity that companies have. And that's what I think underlines BRI. But what has happened as what I've looked at is that a number of countries have taken on debt for a lot of these projects, where China has been doing what the United States and Europe all did during the 50s and 60s. We lent tons and tons of money to developing countries for large infrastructure, capital-intensive projects. We gave the money very cheaply. People love to do it, and it just creates, there's a reason for discipline in finance, because when you have too much, at some point in time, you actually have to repay. And the Chinese have not actually been giving a lot of very, very easy terms. It will be interesting to see how, as we've seen before, countries have dealt with some of these large sums that they've needed to repay. In the case of China, the thing that's interesting about China is that the Paris Club is there in part to let creditor countries look through and work with international institutions as they help countries get out of over-indebtedness crises. China is not a member of it. China actually should be a member of it. China, to some extent, doesn't want to be. It wants to hold itself aloof. But I think it will find, as it goes through more of these countries, where it can't just collect its collateral. It's not going to be able to grab every port where people can't repay them, or national railroad or something like that, without its own political reverberations. So there will end up having to be, probably after quite a lot of disturbance in the system, there will end up having to be an approach of China with other creditors and creditor institutions about how we work. And it will involve as well changing in and thinking through China's place in the international financial institutions. And all the resistance that you see sometimes from Washington and to some extent from European capitals to accepting China as part of the system actually makes it a lot worse for all of us. And I think we have to accept change. We have to manage change, but not try to resist change. And that includes bringing China in as part of the system. All of the things that Penny is talking about in terms of what you can do in the WTO is going to depend as well on China being an active and constructive player. And for a long time, China was basically passive on international rules. It's now being a little bit aggressive, but I think that there are ways to talk it through with them.
Penny, you want to continue on that?
So I would just say that I think, again, as a company that's operating in China and India and a lot of big countries around the world, I would say that I'm becoming a little bit more pessimistic about the ability to continue with one system globally, and that it seems to me that there are some moves being taken by certain countries to create kind of a two system. The US is doing a couple of things, but I would say that again, as a company that's operating in China, we're having to set up very distinct and different systems that serve China and that are not connected with the rest of the world because of China's intense focus on its domestic security, and that is creating the conditions by which companies have to set up very distinct systems just for China that don't necessarily interact with their other systems. And that very practically then plays into some other things. So again, it's domestic decisions China's making about its national security, but it has implications, I think, for how global data flows, global trade flows, some of the other things that are out there. And with that then comes other countries' reactions to such things. So it's something to watch, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we should shy away from continuing to try to work and move forward with common partners. The broader we can cast the net, both in terms of economics as well as values, the more likely we are to kind of build that resilience, build more inclusive societies, and to continue to advance kind of the values-based trade and economic system that we have today. On the second thing I would say, with regards to Charlie's comments, I would just cite Buy America as an example of probably where the US is already doing something with regards to putting in place some things to encourage more resilience, domestic resilience, but we all know, I mean, we're in the middle of a huge hurricane going on here in the East Coast of the United States, and by onshoring everything, you don't necessarily eliminate risk. So we need to think about how we look at our risk and how we build up resilience in ways that is not concentrating risk, but is actually spreading it out a little bit more. Thank you.
Jana, do you want to give a final comment on the decoupling issue? I know you're at present looking into it somewhat, and perhaps some of the indicators of decoupling, whether how deep it is actually going on, or is it more on a rhetorical level still?
Yeah, I would say that it is going on and it is becoming more and more concrete. I think it's very interesting to go over the executive order of Biden administration on the supply chain review, and just to see that there are real sectors that have been earmarked now for reshoring and for, in a sense, decoupling. And these are massive sectors, and there's clear intentions to bring jobs back, to reshore manufacturing. and an endeavor to sort of collaborate with the EU on this. And then on the EU side, this is also taking place. It's taking place maybe most clearly with regards to the critical raw materials, to rare earths. So there's like these lists being made of what are these strategic products that we need to really look out for. And there's really a growing awareness. COVID was a wake-up call in a sense, but I think that on the other hand, they need to be WTO compatible in any way, and that's another challenge how that could be made.
Thanks. And with that, it's 3:15 in Finland. We're scheduled to close at 3:15. I love my own timekeeping here. We're just on time. So thanks a lot to the panelists. I think this was a great discussion. I learned a lot myself. I hope everybody else did as well. And thank you so much for joining. So thanks and goodbye.
Very much.